Welcome to a moment that defied everything they had been taught to believe. When men who had marched under the banner of the swastika surrendered trembling, waiting for punishment, and were met instead with kindness. December 1944. The Ardennes. The forest still shivering with the echoes of gunfire and the slow rumble of American tanks. Snow fell over broken helmets, twisted steel, and the long shadows of men walking with their hands raised high. They had fought to the last bullet, and now in the silence after the storm, they waited for vengeance. But what came next wasn't vengeance. It was mercy. Cigarettes. Blankets. Warm soup passed through trembling fingers. An American soldier handing coffee to the same enemy who had tried to kill him an hour before. Many of the captured Germans stared in disbelief, whispering, "Warum why?" as if kindness itself had become the strangest weapon of war. They had expected hatred, humiliation, perhaps death, but instead they were given humanity. And in that frozen forest, surrounded by wrecked tanks and the smell of smoke and pine, something quietly shifted not on the battlefield, but inside the human heart. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact minute you're hearing this voice. Would you have offered your enemy mercy after everything they had done? This is German POWs were shocked by American kindness after their capture. December 1944. The world was frozen in uncertainty. Europe lay in ruins, its cities reduced to ashes, its people stripped of hope. The war had stretched into its fifth relentless winter, and even the snow carried the smell of smoke and oil. In the West, the once mighty Wehrmacht was collapsing under the weight of endless defeat. Yet in the dark forests of the Ardennes, a final desperate gamble had just been played. The Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last strike against the Allies had turned the silent woods into a graveyard of ambition. The forest was still whispering with echoes of gunfire. You could hear it. The faint groan of engines buried in mud, the distant thud of artillery rolling over the hills, and somewhere, the sharp cry of a crow circling above a frozen body. The snow was not pure white anymore. It was stained brown and gray, mixed with the ash of burned villages and the memory of fire. Along the winding roads, tanks stood like sleeping beasts, their turrets half buried in frost, their metal cold to the touch. And walking between them were men with their hand raised high. German soldiers, some barely out of their teens, marched silently, eyes empty uniforms, stiff from days of blood and ice. The American convoy moved beside them, rifles held but rarely aimed. There was no need. These men were done fighting. The arrogance that once filled German propaganda films, the thunder of the unbreakable Reich, had crumbled into a quiet line of prisoners shuffling toward captivity. Each step they took was a confession, each breath a surrender of pride. The Americans watched them closely, but not cruelly. Many of the U.S. soldiers were just as young. Farm boys from Kansas, steelworkers from Pittsburgh, sons who had never seen Europe before this nightmare. Some of them carried chocolate in their pockets or half-smoked cigarettes tucked behind their ears. And now, as they watched their enemies stumble through the snow, they felt something strange stirring inside. Not victory, not triumph, but a kind of disbelief. They had been told to expect monsters, fanatics who would fight to the last man, brainwashed killers who despised everything American. Yet the men before them looked no different from themselves. Mud-covered, trembling, clutching whatever dignity they could salvage from defeat. Their faces were hollow, their lips cracked, and their hands, once holding rifles, were now shaking from cold and hunger. The propaganda on both sides had prepared them for hatred. But what they saw instead was exhaustion. At one checkpoint near Bastogne, an American sergeant stopped to hand a cup of coffee to a German private. The boy hesitated, unsure if it was a trick. The sergeant only nodded, saying softly, "Drink. You look half dead." The steam rose between them like a fragile peace flag. Moments like that would repeat themselves across hundreds of miles of Europe, small, quiet gestures lost in the thunder of history. By January 1945, the numbers were staggering. More than 3 million German prisoners would fall into Allied hands. By war's end, nearly half of them captured by American forces. Entire divisions surrendered without resistance, their commanders stunned by the sudden collapse of the Reich's final illusion. The U.S. Army faced a logistical nightmare, feeding, housing, and transporting millions of enemy soldiers while still fighting a global war. Yet somehow, they managed. From the makeshift enclosures in France and Belgium to the vast camps across the American heartland, from Texas to Wisconsin, a new kind of battlefield emerged. It was not fought with bullets, but with ethics. What do you do when the enemy stops being a threat and becomes a man again? In one field near Remagen, hundreds of prisoners huddled in trenches under open sky. The nights were freezing, the ground hard as stone. Some American guards passed blankets through the wire. Others built fires near the perimeter so the prisoners could feel the heat drift through the cold air. Not out of orders, but instinct. It was as if the moral compass of war had tilted back toward humanity for a brief, impossible moment. Meanwhile, in the small villages of France, locals emerged from their ruins to watch the endless lines of captured Germans. To them, these were the men who had occupied their towns, stolen their food, killed their brothers. And yet when they saw the prisoners, now pale, starved, broken, even the villagers fell silent. Some looked away. Some spat. Others simply watched, unsure what to feel. War had stripped everyone bare, victim and victor alike. The American officers had clear instructions: treat the prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. No revenge. No abuse. Keep them alive for intelligence, for diplomacy, for the image of a civilized army. But the truth went deeper. For many Americans, this was more than policy, it was conscience. They had seen the death camps, the bombed-out cities, the cost of hate. And somewhere deep inside, they understood that cruelty would only drag them down to the same pit their enemy had fallen into. Still, not every story was gentle. Some guards, hardened by loss, looked at the prisoners with silent fury. They remembered comrades burned in tanks, civilians slaughtered in villages. For them, mercy came slow. There were moments when tempers flared, when revenge almost slipped through discipline. Yet each time the system held. Orders reminded them, you're not here to hate. You're here to win. And winning, they realized, sometimes meant being better than your enemy. By spring 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine, the POW columns stretched for miles. Trucks, jeeps, and captured German vehicles carried the defeated eastward. They passed through towns shattered by bombing raids, skeletal buildings still smoking under gray skies. Civilians watched them pass, unsure if they should cheer or mourn. For some, the sight of captured Germans meant justice. For others, it was only another reminder of how much had been lost. Inside the convoys, men whispered in disbelief. "The Americans are giving us food," one soldier wrote. "They treat us better than our own officers did." In another letter smuggled through camp fences, a captured sergeant confessed, "I think they want us to remember this. To tell our people that they didn't kill us when they could have." Those words would later echo through post-war Germany, seeds of an idea that would grow into reconciliation. Yet amid this uneasy mercy, fear lingered. Many POWs still expected betrayal. Some thought the kindness was a trap, that once the cameras were gone, retribution would begin. Others clung to their Nazi indoctrination, refusing to speak, refusing to believe that compassion could exist beyond propaganda. Time, however, would wear them down. Hunger and fatigue opened cracks in ideology. And through those cracks, humanity seeped in. At night, under the distant rumble of artillery, you could hear the quiet murmur of two languages colliding, English and German trading small phrases, questions, jokes. A guard teaching a prisoner how to say coffee. A prisoner teaching a guard how to say snow. The war was still raging elsewhere. But here behind the wire, something strange was happening, an experiment in empathy. Some historians would later call it one of the great moral victories of the U.S. Army, the ability to hold on to decency in a world that had forgotten it. Others would say it was pragmatic, a way to win hearts for the future Cold War. But for the men who lived it, the ones who drank that first cup of shared coffee in the snow, it was simpler. It was proof that even after everything, a man could still choose not to hate. And so, as the frozen winter of 1944 turned slowly into the muddy thaw of 1945, the story of these German prisoners became something larger, a reflection of how war tests not only armies, but souls. For every act of kindness, there was a shadow of guilt. For every gesture of mercy, a memory of what came before. But still, the march continued, a line of soldiers disappearing into the horizon, their footsteps echoing through history, carried not by victory, but by the quiet, enduring weight of compassion. By early 1945, the numbers had become too large to comprehend. Entire divisions of the German army were dissolving under the weight of defeat. What began as a trickle of prisoners after Normandy turned into a flood after the collapse of the Ardennes offensive. In just a few weeks, more than 350,000 German soldiers were captured by American and British forces. Each convoy that rolled westward carried not only prisoners, but the final remnants of Hitler's delusion uniforms, torn boots, soaked eyes, hollowed by months of fighting. These were men who had once believed themselves invincible, now herded into columns that stretched for miles across the muddy European countryside. American military records describe it with clinical precision. Enemy personnel surrendered voluntarily or captured in combat, total 1,362,000 by April 1945. The U.S. War Department struggled to process such a wave. Field camps had to be built overnight, barbed wire tents, ration lines. Engineers requisitioned every scrap of fencing they could find, transforming abandoned airfields into makeshift prisons. There were so many captives that some were kept in open fields for days before shelter could be provided. The Rhine Meadows' vast plains between Remagen and Andernach became seas of human figures stretching as far as the eye could see. And yet, despite the scale, despite the chaos, the order from Washington was clear. Treat them according to the Geneva Convention. Feed them. Register them. Protect them. The same nation that had just discovered the horror of Dachau and Buchenwald was now choosing restraint, choosing law over rage. The contrast was staggering. American soldiers who had walked through the gates of concentration camps could barely look at the German prisoners without feeling anger burn behind their ribs. And still the camps were organized, medical tents were raised, Red Cross inspections permitted. Each camp ran like a small city. Every man was assigned a number, a tent, a daily ration. The official diet for POWs mirrored that of U.S. soldiers, 200 to 500 calories per day when supplies allowed. Captured officers were given slightly better quarters. Enlisted men shared cots and dugouts. They received cigarettes, soap letters through the International Red Cross. There were rules against forced labor, though many were later assigned to farm or construction work under supervision. It was not comfort, but it was survival. Military historians often speak of the great logistics of mercy, a phrase coined by General George Marshall's staff to describe the effort. Thousands of American soldiers, cooks, medics, and engineers found themselves managing men who only days earlier had been trying to kill them. One lieutenant wrote in his diary, "It's the strangest job I've ever had to feed the wolf after you've broken his teeth." Another note from the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps reads, "We are at once jailers and caretakers, conquerors and guardians." The numbers kept rising. By May 1945, more than 11 million German POWs were in Allied hands across Europe, 3.8 million under American control. The Rhine camps overflowed. Some lacked shelter, leading to disease outbreaks in the cold rain. But even then, American medical officers documented every case, distributed vaccines, and worked alongside captured German doctors to maintain order. It was imperfect, but it was still humane. From the outside, these camps appeared quiet, almost serene, no barbed wire violence, no executions. But inside the minds of the prisoners, a war of belief was raging. Years of propaganda had painted Americans as barbaric, the destroyers of culture, agents of chaos. And now those same barbarians were handing out soup and blankets. Many German soldiers couldn't reconcile the contradiction. Some assumed it was psychological warfare, a trick meant to weaken their resolve before interrogation. Others began to doubt everything they had been told. The U.S. Psychological Warfare Division noticed it quickly. Reports sent to SHAEF headquarters describe a marked transformation among captured Germans. Prisoners who initially refused to speak would later engage in long conversations with guards, asking about baseball jazz or American cities they'd seen in newsreels. One major wrote, "They come to us expecting hate. They leave confused, sometimes grateful." And that confusion spread not through propaganda this time, but through word of mouth. When fresh prisoners arrived, the older ones would whisper, "Don't resist. They treat you decently. You'll live." The effect was immediate. Surrenders increased. Units stopped destroying bridges or sabotaging supplies before capture. The Wehrmacht's discipline collapsed faster than Allied strategists expected. Kindness, in its quiet, unassuming way, became a weapon of disarmament. Yet the American command knew mercy had limits. Not every camp was ideal. Supplies were scarce. Food shortages swept Europe in the spring of 1945. Even civilians in France and Belgium were starving. The U.S. had to make hard choices. In some temporary enclosures, prisoners were given only half rations for days at a time. Rain turned the fields to mud. Men dug shallow holes for shelter. Photographs from the Rhine camps show endless faces behind wire-drenched, shivering, silent. Critics would later accuse the Allies of neglect, some even calling it retribution disguised as logistics. But compared to the Eastern Front, where millions perished in Soviet captivity, the Western camps were a different world. The difference was measured not in statistics, but in spirit. There was no system of revenge here, no hunger for annihilation. The Americans had seen too much horror to perpetuate it. They understood that brutality once unleashed never stops where it begins. In the ruins of Germany, they saw not just the enemy, but the warning of what humanity can become. Still behind the veneer of discipline, small acts of compassion stood out more vividly than orders. In one camp near Reims, a group of American GIs built a small chapel for German prisoners who asked to pray. Elsewhere, soldiers shared their Thanksgiving meals with the men they guarded. In Bavaria, an American officer allowed POWs to form an orchestra playing Bach and Beethoven in the evening cold. Those sounds drifted beyond the barbed wire notes of a civilization that war had tried to erase. In captured letters, many Germans confessed their astonishment. One wrote, "It was the first time in years I was called by my name, not my number." Another said, "They did not punish us for believing. They only asked us to stop killing." But the most extraordinary evidence didn't come from official reports. It came from what happened after the war. When the prisoners were finally repatriated to Germany, thousands carried stories of unexpected decency. They told their families that the Americans had treated them fairly, that the enemy had shown mercy. Those words would later help shape West Germany's post-war attitude toward the United States, laying the early groundwork for alliance instead of resentment. Still, not everyone understood. In bombed-out towns like Dresden and Cologne, survivors struggled to accept tales of American compassion while living among rubble left by Allied bombs. To them, kindness felt like irony. To others, it was hope. The truth, as always, lived between extremes. By the end of 1945, most POWs held in Europe were transferred to more permanent camps or sent overseas. Over 370,000 were shipped to the United States itself, a quiet army of captives scattered across more than 700 camps from California to New York. There, far from the ruins of Europe, they found something few expected: normalcy. The United States treated them not as ghosts of the enemy, but as laborers, students, even guests. They harvested crops, built roads, attended English classes, watched American films in makeshift theaters. Some joined camp choirs, others painted murals on barracks walls. They sent money home through the Red Cross. In Kansas, a local newspaper once reported that the German POWs sing while they work and wave at passing schoolchildren. The War Department monitored everything closely, wary of propaganda accusations. Yet the reports kept coming back: the same low escape rates, minimal violence, and growing respect between guards and prisoners. In one inspection, a colonel wrote simply, "They are adapting, and so are we." The facts were undeniable. America, even in victory, had chosen restraint. And in doing so, it had discovered something rare: that morality could survive the battlefield, if only barely. But beneath those statistics and daily routines, a quieter revolution was happening inside the minds of the men who had once called themselves the master race. As one POW would later write from his camp in Texas, "They defeated us with tanks, but they conquered us with humanity." The documents confirm it. The War Department records, the Red Cross reports, the diaries. But the feeling behind those words cannot be measured. It was not the kindness of saints nor the generosity of angels. It was the fragile, weary mercy of men who had seen enough death to know that killing no longer proved anything. And as the war's smoke drifted into the horizon, those records, dry, factual, methodical, would become the quiet testimony of a strange miracle: that even in the ruins of civilization, empathy could still take root. The frost had not yet melted on the barrels of the abandoned guns when Private Wilhelm Hartmann first saw the faces of his captors. He was 21, a boy from Dresden who had never seen America except in propaganda posters, grotesque, sharp-toothed caricatures with the word "find" scrawled underneath. Now standing knee-deep in slush, he saw none of that. The American who approached him looked just as tired as he felt, helmet tilted back, mud splattered across his face, breath clouding in the cold. For a long moment neither spoke. The wind carried the faint sound of artillery miles away, a hollow echo of a war already dying. Then the American lowered his rifle and gestured toward a nearby jeep. "You hungry?" he asked, the words slow, uncertain. Wilhelm didn't understand at first, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't hatred. It was pity. He followed the gesture, with hesitation, clutching his trembling hands together, as if afraid the air itself might shatter the fragile truce. The jeep's hood was still warm. The American reached inside his coat and handed him a small canned beans, cold but fragrant, and a spoon. Wilhelm hesitated. He had been taught that any gift from the enemy was a trap. But hunger has no ideology. He ate, his body shaking with both relief and shame. Around him, hundreds of other Germans were doing the same: men who hours ago had fired into those same lines, now squatting in silence, accepting food from their former enemies. Nearby, an American medic named James O'Donnell walked between the rows of prisoners. His hands were cracked from cold, his uniform damp from melted snow. He had been at Bastogne, had watched friends freeze to death under the bombardment. He told himself he wouldn't feel sympathy for the enemy. But when he saw the German with frostbite on his fingers, sitting barefoot on the ground, he stopped. Without a word, he knelt down, opened his medical kit, and began to wrap the man's feet. The German stared, bewildered, and muttered something James couldn't understand. Still, the medic smiled and said softly, "You'll walk again, buddy. Maybe not today, but you'll walk." In that moment, brief, unremarkable, the war seemed to pause. The sound of engines faded, replaced by the quiet rustle of snow falling through smoke. Somewhere, a soldier began to hum a low, trembling tune that others slowly recognized, Silent Night. It was strange. This Christmas hymn sung in broken voices, some in English, some in German, all drifting into the same cold sky. The guards didn't stop it. They just listened. Days later, in a makeshift camp near Andernach, the prisoners were lined up for registration. There was no shouting, no beatings, just paperwork, names, photographs. One American sergeant joked with his clerk, calling the camera a passport maker for hell. Yet when the flash went off, he looked at the faces of the men before him and saw no devils, only exhaustion. A few smiled nervously. Others stood stiffly, clutching their torn overcoats like children holding onto blankets. The sergeant thought of his own brother still fighting in the Pacific. He wondered if someone somewhere might show him the same mercy if he ever fell into enemy hands. Inside the wire, life began to take shape. Rations were distributed, canned meat, bread, watery coffee. The Americans divided the camp into small sections, assigning leaders among the prisoners. Discipline returned not through threat, but habit. They built latrines, cleared snow, dug drainage trenches. Each day they lined up for roll call, as if still part of an army that no longer existed. And in the evenings, they talked. Not of Hitler, not of glory, but of home. Of wives they hadn't written to, of sons they'd never met. Corporal Carl Stein, a former tank mechanic, kept a small notebook hidden under his jacket. In it, he wrote about the day he was captured and the strange kindness he couldn't understand. "The Americans offered us cigarettes," he scribbled. "At first I refused. I thought they would laugh or mock me, but they only nodded. Later I took one. I smoked it slowly, tasting not tobacco but disbelief. His notebook would survive the war. Years later it would be displayed in a museum, its pages yellowed, but still legible, a fragment of humanity preserved in ink. One afternoon, an American chaplain entered the camp. He carried no weapon, only a Bible and a small wooden cross. He asked permission to hold a service not for the victors, but for the defeated. The guards stood aside as hundreds of German prisoners gathered in the cold field. The chaplain spoke softly, his breath forming clouds in the air. "War ends," he said, "but the soul must go on living." A translator repeated his words in German. For a long while no one moved. Then one man, perhaps out of instinct, began to sing again. The same hymn from the forest. Stille Nacht. Others joined. The chaplain bowed his head, and the sound swelled, broken voices rising through wire and wind. That night, one of the guards wrote in his journal, "It was the strangest peace I've ever felt. The kind you don't celebrate, you just survive." But not every moment carried grace. There were still tempers, still mistrust. When rations ran short, arguments erupted between prisoners. Guards barked orders, sometimes harshly, to maintain control. A few prisoners tried to escape, not from cruelty, but confusion. They didn't know where home was anymore. The Americans caught them, brought them back, and locked them in separate tents. Yet even then, no executions, no beatings. The punishment was time and silence. Weeks turned into months. As the front lines pushed eastward and Germany's cities crumbled, word spread among the camps Hitler was dead. The war was over. The announcement came through a tin loudspeaker, its voice flat, almost indifferent. Some prisoners wept. Others stared at the ground. Wilhelm Hartmann, the boy from Dresden, stood near the fence listening. He thought of his father killed in the bombing of the home that might no longer exist. And then he saw the same American who had fed him on that first day walking past with a thermos of coffee. Their eyes met, two soldiers from opposite worlds, sharing the same hollow silence. The kindness continued quietly, almost stubbornly. The guards played music on the camp's loudspeakers, swing tunes, jazz, the sound of laughter, recorded from somewhere far away. It drifted over the wire like a memory of life itself. Some prisoners began learning English from old newspapers. Others volunteered to help rebuild the fences, repair the trucks, clean the kitchens. For every act of work, they received a token, a small sign of trust. One evening near sunset, Wilhelm found himself sweeping the camp's main path when the American medic, James O'Donnell, stopped beside him. "You still got those feet," he joked. Wilhelm smiled faintly. "Better," he said, his accent heavy. James nodded. "Good. You'll need them. War's over. Time to walk home." They stood there for a moment, no salute, no ceremony, just two men tired beyond words, staring at the orange sky. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the world was already rewriting their story. In the weeks that followed, Red Cross trucks arrived carrying supplies and letters. Some prisoners received news that their families were alive. Others received nothing. But the camp itself had changed. There was laughter now, cautious, fragile laughter, that broke through the monotony like birds returning after a long winter. One guard, Corporal Henry Lewis, kept a photograph of the camp's baseball field. In it, you can see German prisoners playing their makeshift uniforms, a patchwork of gray and khaki. American soldiers stand on the sidelines, cheering. No one is smiling widely, not yet, but their faces are open, unguarded. For a moment, they are simply men under the same sky. Years later, Henry would tell his grandson, "That day I realized we'd won something more than a war. We'd won back our humanity." And maybe that's what mercy really is, not forgiveness, not forgetting, but the simple act of seeing the enemy as a reflection of yourself. As spring returned and the grass began to grow around the barbed wire, the prisoners watched the world change color again. The snow melted into mud, the mud into earth, and the earth into something alive. In that transformation, they saw a hint of what they had lost and what they might still become. The war would haunt them forever. But so would this, the sound of a stranger's kindness, the warmth of a shared meal, the quiet voice that said, "You're safe now." It was in those small human moments that the real surrender happened. Not of armies, but of hatred itself. They had been told that the Americans were beasts, that capture meant humiliation, torture, maybe even slow death. The radio voices from Berlin had whispered it for years, that the Allies were monsters in human skin. Leaflets scattered through German towns warned that surrender would mean the end of dignity, the end of Germany itself. And yet, standing behind the wire, they began to realize the truth was not what the Reich had promised. The myth was cracking, and through the cracks, the light began to seep in. A captured corporal from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division once wrote, "They treated us better than our officers did." It broke something inside me. I didn't know whether to be grateful or ashamed. He wasn't alone. Across thousands of camps, that same feeling rippled like a quiet wave, disbelief giving way to reflection, reflection turning into guilt. The propaganda had told them Americans were cowards, softened by luxury. But the men they met were disciplined, capable, kind, without weakness. It was a reversal so complete that it shook the moral core of every prisoner who still clung to Nazi pride. The U.S. Office of War Information collected reports from the field, sociological studies, psychological notes, interview transcripts. The files speak with bureaucratic calm, subject attitudes show marked confusion upon humane treatment. Ideological conditioning eroding rapidly. Behind that dry language was something far more human, the astonishment of soldiers who discovered mercy could wound deeper than bullets. In one camp near Chartres, a group of prisoners were shown a short film about the liberation of Paris. They watched in silence as cheering crowds filled the screen. When the lights came on, a German lieutenant murmured, "They don't look like barbarians." The American guard, a sergeant from Ohio, only shrugged and said, "Guess we're not what you were told." That moment lingered, the quiet disarming of a myth. The contrast was everywhere. On one side, the remnants of a regime that had built its identity on cruelty, on domination, on absolute obedience. On the other, a democracy that, despite its flaws, had chosen law over revenge. The Germans had believed they were the chosen warriors of civilization, fighting savages from the West. But now it was the Americans who showed civilization in the simplest acts: food shared, rules followed, lives spared. The numbers tell part of the story. Of the 3.8 million Germans captured by the Americans, less than 1% died in captivity, most from illness or exposure during the chaotic first weeks after surrender. Compare that to the Eastern Front, where over 3 million German POWs vanished in Soviet camps, never to return. The difference wasn't just statistical. It was moral. To many prisoners, this realization came slowly, painfully. They began to question everything they had been taught, the speeches, the slogans, the symbols. In the quiet of the camp nights, you could hear them whispering to one another, asking, "What if we were wrong?" Some refused to believe it, clinging to the ideology like a drowning man to driftwood. But most began to let go. A U.S. Army chaplain named Reverend Charles Decker described it in his post-war memoir. "I saw men who had worshipped the Reich salute our flag, in respect not because we demanded it, but because they could no longer hate what they understood." It wasn't triumph, it was transformation. The Americans hadn't just captured an army, they had conquered an illusion. In April 1945, General Eisenhower visited one of the Rhine camps. The war was ending, but his words to the soldiers guarding the prisoners carried a strange gravity. "Remember," he said, "you are the face of America to these men. How you act now will outlast every battle we've won." The men took it to heart. Many didn't know that their quiet discipline, their refusal to degrade the enemy, would later shape the very image of America in post-war Europe. Even the German officers noticed. Colonel Hans Rehfeld, who surrendered near Remagen, later testified, "We had been taught that Americans had no honor, but their fairness was our first lesson in defeat." He returned to Germany in 1946 and joined efforts to rebuild local government, inspired, he said, by the sense of justice he had seen in the camps. But not all contrasts were comforting. For every act of mercy, there was the haunting memory of devastation. When prisoners read newspapers about the destruction of Dresden, about the smoldering ruins of their cities, many felt anger rise again. How could a nation capable of such mercy also unleash such fire from the sky? The contradiction tore at them. Some called it hypocrisy. Others called it justice. And in that tension, the real psychological war began, the struggle to reconcile compassion with catastrophe. The Americans, too, were conflicted. Some guards admitted feeling resentment. They had lost friends in Normandy, in the Ardennes, in the skies over Europe. To feed the men who had caused that loss felt wrong, unnatural. But orders were orders, and duty had its own kind of clarity. One guard from Iowa wrote home, "I hate them, and yet I can't hate the ones I see." They're just boys, like us. That line would be printed in a small-town newspaper months later, a quiet echo of a truth the entire world was learning the hard way. As the war ended, the contrasts deepened. Germany lay in ruins, cities reduced to ash, families scattered, millions homeless. Yet in camps across America, German prisoners were working fields, repairing bridges, even performing concerts. Photographs from Camp Hearn, Texas, show smiling faces, German POWs in neat rows singing folk songs, their guards watching with folded arms. To anyone looking from the outside, it was surreal. The defeated enemy singing under the flag of their conquerors, not as slaves, but as guests. The U.S. press began covering the story. Headlines read, "Enemy finds humanity in captivity." Journalists visited the camps, noting how discipline and routine had created what one called islands of strange civility in the sea of war. Public opinion, at first skeptical, began to shift. Letters poured into the War Department from citizens who had met POWs working on farms or construction sites. Many wrote of surprise how polite, educated, and humble the Germans seemed. One Kansas farmer told a reporter, "They work hard, say please and thank you, and ask about baseball. You wouldn't know they ever fought us." The paradox fascinated sociologists. How could men indoctrinated in hate adjust so quickly? The answer perhaps was simple hunger for normalcy. The camps offered what the war had stolen: structure, food, purpose, safety. And in that fragile environment, humanity began to rebuild itself. Still, not every story ended in redemption. Some prisoners could not forgive even as they were forgiven. A few carried bitterness until their dying days. One ex-SS sergeant interviewed in 1952 admitted, "I was treated well, but I could not feel grateful. It made me feel small." Mercy, it seemed, was its own kind of mirror, forcing men to see themselves as they truly were. In the balance of history, these contrasts would shape two nations' futures. Germany would rebuild under the Marshall Plan, guided by the very country that had defeated it. The seeds of that alliance of NATO of the New West were planted not in conference rooms, but in the quiet fields of POW camps, where kindness had done what ideology never could. By 1946, when the last prisoners began returning home, many carried with them a strange nostalgia for captivity. They missed the order, the fairness, even the guards. In post-war Germany, some gathered in small reunions, writing letters to the Americans who had once watched over them. A few even emigrated to the United States years later, chasing the echo of that improbable decency. History would record the weapons, the battles, the treaties. But somewhere between those lines, another story lived, the story of mercy, as resistance, of compassion, as strength. Because in the end, the greatest contrast wasn't between nations or ideologies. It was between what men were told to be and what they chose to become when the guns fell silent. And as that silence spread across Europe, through forests still scarred by fire, through cities that no longer had names, the world began to understand that kindness, too, could be a victory, and sometimes the only one worth remembering. When the war ended, the silence was unbearable. No gunfire, no orders, no engines echoing across the sky, only the sound of wind through the ruins and the quiet shuffle of men trying to remember how to live. The prisoners who had once filled the American camps began to disappear, one transport at a time, returning to a homeland they no longer recognized. For many, the real battle was just beginning, not against armies, but against memory itself. Wilhelm Hartmann, the young man from Dresden, stepped off the train in the spring of 1946. The air was heavy with coal dust, the sky gray and indifferent. The city he had left behind 2 years earlier was gone, replaced by skeletal buildings and the smell of damp ash. He walked the streets like a ghost, searching for the house where his mother had once hung flowers by the window. There was nothing left but a foundation and a pile of stone. He sat there for a long time. staring at the emptiness, clutching a small packet of sugar he had brought from the camp. It was the only sweet thing left in his world. All across Germany, stories like his multiplied, millions of soldiers coming home not as heroes, but as witnesses to the failure of everything they had believed. Yet among them was a strange undercurrent of calm, a softness in the way they spoke of their captors. They talked about the Americans not with hatred, but with bewildered respect. One man described them as firm but fair. Another, a former Luftwaffe pilot, told his son, "They didn't break us, they taught us what being civilized actually means." American kindness had not erased the scars of war, but it had planted something deeper, a question that refused to die. What does it mean to be victorious? What does it mean to be human after you've seen what hatred can do? For the United States, too, this question lingered. The soldiers who had guarded the camps came home changed. They carried with them the memory of faces they had once feared, faces that had smiled back across barbed wire, uncertain but grateful. Many wrote letters years later to the men they had watched over. A few even received replies, long, careful letters written in German script, thanking them for small acts that had seemed meaningless at the time. In archives across both nations, you can still find them, creased envelopes, faded ink, words trembling between guilt and gratitude. "You may not remember me," one began, "but I remember you every day. You handed me bread when I was starving. I never forgot." It wasn't politics. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something quieter, the acknowledgement of shared survival. Not all Americans were comfortable with that memory. Some argued that mercy had been misplaced, that those who had served Hitler's machine deserved nothing but hardship. Others saw it differently. They believed that how America treated its enemies said more about its future than its victory. General Eisenhower himself would later write, "Our strength was not only in arms, but in restraint. The world would judge us not by what we destroyed, but by what we chose to preserve." For the Germans who had lived through captivity, that restraint became a mirror, a moral weight they would carry for decades. In post-war letters and memoirs, they described the camps as islands of order amid the chaos, as if the discipline and fairness of their captors had given them a glimpse of what their own nation had lost. They spoke of American guards who shared cigarettes, who taught them English phrases, who joked awkwardly across the cultural divide. Many would later use those words to rebuild bridges, as translators, as teachers, as men trying to make sense of a broken world. In one extraordinary case, a former POW named Klaus Meyer returned to America in 1953, not as a prisoner, but as a guest of the very family whose farm he had once worked on under guard. The local newspaper printed a photograph of him shaking hands with the farmer, both smiling, both old, now both changed. The caption read, "Enemies once, friends forever." The story spread across the country, a small symbol of what mercy could become when time allowed it to breathe. Meanwhile, in Germany, the echoes of that kindness began to shape something larger, a political and cultural shift that would define a generation. When the Marshall Plan poured billions into rebuilding the continent, many Germans accepted American aid with a surprising lack of resentment. They remembered the POW camps, the order, the fairness, the strange dignity that had survived even in defeat. The United States had shown them a different kind of power, one that didn't rely on fear. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, gratitude replaced bitterness. Historians often mark 1949, the birth of West Germany, as the start of a new chapter. But the truth is that chapter began years earlier behind the wire, in the quiet discipline of the camps, in the way an American guard said, "You'll be all right," instead of "you'll pay." In the unspoken lesson that strength and cruelty were not the same thing. When the war ended, that lesson didn't vanish. It echoed through policies, through friendships, through generations. Some German veterans dedicated their lives to peace work, traveling to schools and churches to speak about what they had learned in captivity. One of them, Friedrich Bauer, stood before a class of young students in Hamburg and said, "I met America before I met freedom. They taught me both." The room fell silent. Outside, the world was already shifting again, the Cold War dividing the same continents that war had nearly destroyed. But between America and Germany, a strange trust endured, built not from treaties or armies, but from memory, the memory of decency in indecent times. In one documentary interview decades later, an old man with watery blue eyes looked into the camera and whispered, "They didn't treat us like enemies. They treated us like men." That was the hardest part to live with. His voice broke on the last word, not from pain, but from something softer, older, beyond language. Regret, maybe, or awe. And so the story came full circle. The young Americans who had offered kindness returned home to start families, build lives, raise children who would never know the taste of war. The Germans they had once guarded rebuilt their cities, their faith, their place in the world. But deep within each side remained an invisible scar and a quiet promise. That kindness, even in the shadow of destruction, could outlast ideology. It's easy to forget now, in the blur of modern cynicism, that there was once a generation who learned this truth not from books, but from hunger and frost, and the tremble of a stranger's hand passing them bread. Those who survived carried that memory like a fragile ember, small, glowing, untouchable. It burned not with pride, but with humility. In museums and archives, the evidence remains ration cards, diaries, letters, faded photographs of smiling men in mismatched uniforms standing together in some forgotten corner of America or France. They are not heroes. They are not villains. They are simply proof that decency can exist where logic says it shouldn't. The historian Gerhard Weinberg once said, "The Americans won twice, first with weapons, then with conscience." He was right. Because conscience is what remains when the banners fall and the nations crumble. It is the last frontier that war cannot conquer. As the years passed, the POWs aged, their memories dimming like photographs left in the sun. Some returned to America in their final years, not as soldiers but as tourists, tracing the places where they had once been prisoners. They stood at the edges of cornfields, at the gates of old camps, long dismantled, and felt the ghost of those days in the wind. A few wept. A few smiled. Most simply stood in silence. Because how do you thank someone for showing you mercy when you didn't deserve it? The answer perhaps is, you live differently. You pass it forward. You teach your children that even in the darkest winter there can be warmth. That the truest victory is not in defeating your enemy, but in refusing to become him. And somewhere in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, where this story began, the wind still carries a faint echo. The sound of boots crunching in surrender. The clink of tin cups against steel. The soft, almost unbelieving voice of a soldier whispering, "They fed us. They let us live." The war ended long ago, but that echo never really stopped. It lingers quiet, human, enduring, reminding us that sometimes the greatest power a man can hold is the choice not to use it. The war ended, but the silence it left behind never truly did. It stretched across continents, through the broken fields of Europe, across the wide Atlantic, into the quiet hearts of men who had once stood on opposite sides of the wire. Time moved forward. Buildings rose again, cities were rebuilt. Children were born into peace, but deep beneath all that noise, a faint echo still lived. An echo of kindness in a place where none was expected. Sometimes, history is remembered not by the thunder of victory, but by the softness that followed it. A soldier handing a cigarette to his prisoner. A medic kneeling to wrap the wounds of the man who might have killed him the day before. a guard sharing coffee with a stranger who spoke a different language but felt the same cold. These moments never made it into textbooks or war memorials, but they stayed alive in the small invisible corners of human memory, passed down like secret heirlooms of decency. Decades later, those same men, gray-haired now bent by time, would meet again in peace. At reunions on forgotten airfields in church halls filled with photographs yellowed by age. They would shake hands, those same hands that once held rifles, and for a brief second they would feel the weight of history lifted. Some laughed softly, others wept without shame. One former prisoner, now an old man with trembling fingers, told an interviewer, "It wasn't the food that saved us. It was the way they looked at us, like we were still human." His voice cracked at the word human, as if it was still too fragile to hold. For the Americans who had served as guards, the memories were quieter, but no less enduring. Many had gone home to their farms, their factories, their families, carrying with them a sense of something unfinished. They had seen their enemies not as monsters, but as mirrors, and that realization stayed with them for the rest of their lives. In small-town VFW halls over beer and silence, they would sometimes talk about it. Not in pride, not in guilt, but in awe. "You spend your life preparing to hate," one veteran said, "and then you meet the man you're supposed to hate, and he looks just like you." It's easy now to forget the fragility of that moment, the razor's edge between vengeance and restraint. The war could have ended differently. The Americans could have answered fire with fire, cruelty with cruelty, and history might have applauded them for it. But they didn't. Somehow, amid the ruins of the most destructive conflict the world had ever seen, they chose discipline over rage, law over chaos, humanity over the hunger for retribution. That choice, quiet, invisible, unglamorous, changed everything. It shaped how nations would rise from ashes, how enemies would become allies, how Europe itself would find the strength to rebuild. The Cold War would divide the world again, but somewhere buried under the rhetoric and fear that earlier lesson endured that kindness is not weakness, it is control. The kind of control that defines civilization itself. If you stand today in one of those old camps or what remains of them, you won't find monuments or marble statues. You'll find fields, grass growing where barbed wire once cut into the wind, children playing where guards once stood. The echoes are faint now, a rusted nail, a foundation stone, a fragment of a wooden sign with the faded words, S Army PW Camp. But if you listen, if you really listen, you can almost hear it. The sound of boots on frost, the murmur of foreign tongues, the small, ordinary kindnesses that rewrote the ending of a terrible story. Because history is not just what we did, it's what we refused to do. The Americans refused to become what they fought against. And the Germans, faced with that refusal, were forced to confront something their ideology could never explain: mercy. That shock, that revelation, became the turning point, not just for prisoners, but for a whole nation learning how to live again. For years afterward, the letters continued. German families writing to the United States, sending photographs, recipes, Christmas cards. One former POW sent a handmade clock to the family of his former guard, with a note that read, "Time has passed, but gratitude does not." The clock still hangs in that farmhouse, ticking softly, a reminder that even the smallest acts can outlast wars. In the archives of the Red Cross, there's a record from 1947, a report stamped "Routine Observation." It mentions the morale of returning prisoners, noting that many expressed unexpected admiration for American order and fairness. Just a line buried in paperwork, but between those words lies an entire civilization's rebirth. It wasn't forced upon them by conquest. It was taught to them by example. And maybe that's what history truly is, a collection of examples waiting to be learned or ignored. The American camps weren't perfect. There was hunger-cold bureaucracy, but there was also dignity, and in the aftermath of genocide and ruin, dignity was revolutionary. We tend to think of power as something loud, something that dominates, destroys, bends others to will. But real power, the kind that builds instead of breaks, often speaks softly. It doesn't march or shout. It simply chooses not to descend. The kindness shown to those German prisoners was not sentimental. It was strategic, moral, deliberate. It was the assertion of a truth that the war had nearly erased, that humanity is not a luxury of peace, but a necessity of survival. So what remains of it now? 8 decades later, the soldiers are gone. The camps are gone. But the idea, the fragile idea that compassion can exist even between enemies, still lingers like smoke after a fire. In a world that keeps finding new ways to divide itself, maybe that is the lesson worth remembering. In the end, the story of German POWs shocked by American kindness isn't really about the war at all. It's about what happens when the guns stop and the soul of a nation is tested not by its enemies, but by its own conscience. It's about the miracle of restraint and the quiet courage it takes to be gentle when you have every reason not to be. Somewhere, in an attic in Germany, an old diary still rests in a wooden box. Its pages are brittle, its ink fading. The last line reads simply, "They gave me bread. They gave me life. They gave me back myself." And maybe that's the real victory. Not in flags or medals or parades, but in that single anonymous confession whispered by a man who learned that kindness can survive even in the coldest winter of the human heart. The story ends there, but its echo goes on across generations, across oceans, across every border where mercy must choose between silence and survival. Because history remembers the wars we fight, but humanity remembers the hands that reached across them.